With Conference Championship Weekend in the books, it's time to start the debate. Who is in? Who are the four teams that will be competing in this year's college football playoff? Well, this season, it's really not a debate. The only real debate is seeding, because it is almost 100% certain that the four teams that will be competing in this year's college football playoff are the Ohio State Buckeyes, the LSU Tigers, the Clemson Tigers, and the Oklahoma Sooners. What's all up for debate now is who is the number 1 seed and who is the number 2 seed, because that is a really important debate to have. Because whoever's number 1 is going to get to play Oklahoma, and whoever is number 2 has to play Clemson, a team that nobody wants to play in the college football playoff because of Clemson's experience on offense. They've been there and done that team. Clemson's the most experienced team in this college football playoff because they've been in that college football playoff national championship before. They've won championships. So that's really important to figure out. So what I have is I have my personal top 4 and who should be what seed. So I want to start off with what is definitely deserving of respect, and that's with Clemson. Now, Clemson hasn't gotten the respect that I feel like they deserve, because Clemson, they can only play with what's in front of them. And despite not having a good resume, or at least a respectable resume, compared to some 2-loss teams out there like Baylor and Georgia and even Wisconsin, but Clemson, they deserve some respect because they have a non-conference win against an SC program in Texas A&M. But A&M was number 12 at the time, and they won convincingly. They essentially won by 2 possessions, maybe even 3 possessions, depending on how you want to look at it, because Texas A&M's 1 touchdown that game came in the last remaining seconds of that contest. So Clemson essentially won by at least 20 in that. And they also have a convincing win over Virginia, who was number 23, 62-17. Now, even though those look like their only 2 respectable wins this season based off of resume, Clemson still managed to get 8 wins over bowl-eligible teams this season. And that is very respectable, because with number 4 Oklahoma, their resume, they only have 5 wins over bowl-eligible teams this season. And they have wins over Texas, who was number 11. They have a win over Baylor, who was number 13. Have a win against Oklahoma State in Bedlam on the road, who was 21. Against Baylor the first time was on the road. So Oklahoma, they do have 2 road wins. And they have a win over Baylor in that Big 12 championship game, which the Bears are number 7. Now, despite Oklahoma's resume looking good, they really only have 5 wins over bowl-eligible teams, because their non-conference schedule was Houston, South Dakota, and UCLA. And none of those teams are bowl-eligible. South Dakota is not even in the FBS. But Clemson, they do have a respectable non-conference win. And LSU has a respectable non-conference win as well, which is what the big debate is, who's number 1 between Ohio State and LSU. But the thing about this is, both these teams are very deserving. And I really want to know tomorrow, when this top 4 is revealed, well, more than likely the seedings, I really want to know how close the margin is, or how close it really was, between number 1 and number 2. Could LSU's convincing victory over Georgia in the SEC title game be enough to have the Tigers jump over Ohio State for that number 1 seed? And Ohio State with the recency bias in a way, because Ohio State has some momentum coming into this ranking, because in the last 3 weeks they have played the number 8 team in the country in Penn State, the number 13 team in the country, Michigan, on the road, and they played the number 8 team in the country this week again in Wisconsin. So Ohio State, they do have momentum coming into this based off of the gauntlet they've had in these last several weeks of the season. But let's look over LSU's resume. They have a win over Texas on the road when Texas was number 9, which was at one point the biggest win that anybody has had on their resume throughout those first 2 weeks. Then they have a win over Florida, 42-28, 2-possession game. They have a win over Auburn, the number 9 team in the country at the time. A win over Alabama on the road, who was number 3 at the time. And they have that win over Georgia today in the SEC championship game. The Bulldogs number 4 coming into that game, 37-10. So a 4-possession victory for the LSU Tigers against the number 4 team in the country. But here's where Ohio State has a legitimate argument. Let's look at Ohio State's resume. And you may think that this resume for Ohio State is not a big deal, but it's almost like LSU's, but it's a little bit different. And by the way, LSU has 9 wins over bowl-eligible teams this season. So let's go through Ohio State's resume. Ohio State has a win over Florida Atlantic. I know it's really not a big deal, but you'll find out why it's a big deal in just a second. They have a win over Miami, Ohio. They have a win over Indiana. They have a win over Cincinnati. They have a win over Michigan State, who was in the top 25, ranked 25th in the country at the time, 34-10. A win over Wisconsin the first time when the Badgers were number 13. As I discussed a minute ago, a victory over number 8 Penn State, convincingly, 28-17. Although they were pushed a little bit, they got off to a big start in the game, but Penn State was chipping away at Ohio State's lead in that game. So you can argue and say that they were somewhat tested in that matchup. A win over number 13 Michigan on the road. And this week, a win over number 8 Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game. And they also have a win in week 2 over Cincinnati. And here's why that the wins over Florida Atlantic, Miami, Ohio, and Cincinnati are really worth noting. Because Florida Atlantic is a conference champion. They won the Conference USA Championship. And Miami, Ohio is also a conference champion because they won the MAC Championship. And Cincinnati, if maybe one or two things went differently in today's game, they would have been the American Athletic Champions. So Ohio State, they have 2 wins over conference champions. I know it's not a big deal, but you got to look at all conference champions because it's very hard to win a conference championship no matter what conference you're in. Whether you're in the Sun Belt or Conference USA or the MAC Championship. Just any conference championship is hard to win. And Ohio State, they have 9 wins over bowl-eligible teams. In Indiana, they ended the season with 8 wins. And Florida Atlantic, despite the bad start to the season, they still managed to win 10 out of their last 11 games on their schedule. And Cincinnati, they really they do have 3 losses, but 2 of them are to one team. So if you want to look at it, Cincinnati has 2 losses on the season. So Ohio State, they have the resume to really argue that they deserve the number 1 seed. But here's my overall take on this. I do want to go through my top 4 personally. And I do want to start off with the obvious, as I said just a moment ago. I think Oklahoma, they should stay at number 4. I don't think that despite Oklahoma having more wins over ranked opponents than Clemson, I still think Oklahoma should stay at number 4 just for the sole purpose of Oklahoma doesn't have a respectable non-conference win, and they only have 5 wins over bowl-eligible teams. And Clemson should still be at number 3. 1, because Clemson is undefeated, but 2, because they have 8 wins over bowl-eligible teams. So the big question is who is number 1 and who's number 2? And this could matter because Clemson, despite people thinking they haven't played anybody all season, We thought this. We somewhat thought the same thing last year. They had one close game this season, just like last year, and they turned out to blow out Alabama 45-16 in the national championship last year. So this will end up mattering. Who is number one and number two? But if you ask me, I think that both these teams, they are deserving of the number one seed. But I just have to give it to Ohio State. I know LSU may have the better quality at this point, which quality is very important. But I think Ohio State's quality got a lot better with conference championship weekend, especially with Florida Atlantic and Miami, Ohio winning their conference championships. I do think somewhat the committee is going to look at that and put Ohio State number one. But I do respect LSU and what they've done this season. But I just think Ohio State is going to be the number one team. Although with Georgia's lackluster performance against LSU, with LSU dominating Georgia in today's SEC championship game, I can understand why you would put LSU number one, because the SEC conference is more of a gauntlet than the Big Ten. But I just like the momentum Ohio State has been on in these last 3 to 4 weeks of the season. They have wins over Penn State, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the last 3 weeks of the season. They've beaten Wisconsin twice this season. And they were tested for the first time this season, like really tested, because they found themselves down 21-7 at the half, but ended up outscoring the Badgers 24-0 in the second half. So I think the committee, they may end up, maybe it could dock them a little bit. But I think Ohio State's deserving of it, but I could see them putting LSU number one. But I feel like there may be no need to change that. Either way, I still think that Ohio State would be at least a 2.5 touchdown favorite over Oklahoma. And I think LSU would be at least a touchdown favorite against Clemson anyway. And we could easily end up seeing Ohio State and LSU in the title game anyway. So overall, I think Ohio State is deserving of being the number one seed, but I could see the committee putting LSU at number one based off their quality performance in today's SEC championship game. But Ohio State's quality improved with Florida Atlantic and Miami, Ohio winning their conference championships. So that is all I have for this. My top four. I have Ohio State at 1, LSU at 2, Clemson at 3, and Oklahoma at 4. That is my personal top 4, but I could easily see this flipping. It's going to be interesting to see what happens tomorrow afternoon. The big question is, how close is the margin between Ohio State and LSU for that number one seed? So, I'll see you next time. Have a good night, and take care.